Hello, everyone. We will wait a couple of minutes before starting. I hope you can hear us and see us.
Okay. Understood.
So just a couple of minutes and then we will start the webinar. Great, I think we will start. Hello, everyone. My name is Fiore Longo. I am a campaigner at Survival International, the global movement for Indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much for joining today. We are also live streaming this event. So I just going to give you some head up. So as you might know, many of you have been contacted by our press department. So you must have received or briefed, but maybe there are people joining who hasn't. So just going to do a brief introduction of what we're going to talk today about with two experts. We are having today Frederick Ash, which is a former investment banker who today is the director of the Belgian think tank Green Finance Observatory, and Simon Council, who is an independent researcher and writer on conservation, human rights, and nature-based solutions. And he's the former head of Rainforest Foundation UK, and also worked as currently as a consultant to Survival International. In the next weeks, we are going to assist to the 5th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is a very important meeting because it's the first one after the adoption in 2022 of the Global Action Plan for Biodiversity, or you might have heard about it as the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the meeting starting on the 21st October, will attempt to resolve some important unfinished business that are related to this global biodiversity framework. Especially, there will be a lot of talk about financing, so the funding. There will be a review. They will review efforts to implement the plan, in particularly how to monitor the efforts of this plan. And the convention will also be a platform for promoting the emergent concept of biodiversity credits. All of these issues, so the funding of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the monitoring, and the issue of the biodiversity credit, could have terrible consequences for Indigenous peoples, for the land and their lives. So we are going to discuss about it today. I will be moderating this press conference. The idea is that both Frederick and Simon will explain deeply in a short time these key issues. So most, as I said, funding, monitoring, and biodiversity credits, and then there will be a time for questions. You can ask your questions when it's time, both raising your hand with the button in the Zoom, or by typing in the chat box, the question and answer box. We will have an eye on both of these things, so you can ask the questions in the way you prefer. We will, of course, when you raise your hand, we will give you the possibility to ask the question. Ideally, if you can, when you both type the question or ask the question, explain who you are, your name, and what or surname, and the media you work for. And if your mother tongue is Italian, Spanish, or French, and you don't feel like asking the question in English, you can type it in the chat in your language, and I will translate it for Frederick and Simon. And at the end of the conference, I will also share contact details of my colleagues in survival who are working in the press department and can arrange individual interviews for you if you wish so. So we will start with Simon Council. Yes, I hope you can connect. Simon, welcome. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much. So I'll share a few slides with you that will hopefully help keep things clear. If you can see that. Yeah, so Fiore's introduced what I'm basically going to talk about, which is two of the key aspects of the upcoming GBF discussions under the Convention on Biodiversity COP16. And one of the most important ones is funding, as Fiore mentioned, and there are really two aspects of that we're particularly concerned about. And the first of those is the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. I'll come on to explain more about that in a moment. And the second aspect of it, because it does really boil down to funding actually, is this new concept of biodiversity credits, which will certainly be a substantive issue of discussion at the meeting in Colombia. And another issue which we're concerned about in terms of its potential impacts on Indigenous rights is the monitoring of this new, what's now a 6-7 year implementation plan for the convention. I'll start with the second of those actually, and go through this very quickly. So assuming that you're broadly aware of what the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is about, it's a series of high-level aims to pursue the implementation of the Convention on Biodiversity up until 2030, along with a set of 22, I think it is, specific targets that the 180 or so members of the Convention on Biodiversity have agreed to back in 2022. And the question is, of course, as ever, how does the global community monitor the implementation and progress, if that's what it is, towards these targets? There has been a fairly sophisticated and extensive monitoring plan developed for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and I'll just call it the GBF for the sake of simplicity. Over the last couple of years, in fact, some of it was agreed even before the plan itself had been fully adopted. But the question is, where in this monitoring plan is the question of Indigenous rights? And this might seem like a relatively technical, minor issue, but actually it can be of serious consequence for Indigenous peoples. And I'll give you an example. So one of the specific targets in the GBF is the target number 3, the so-called 30 by 30 target, under which it's set out that the members of the CBD, that's most nations on Earth, will attempt to establish by 2030 that at least 30% of all land and all seas is put under some form of protective status. Now, this would effectively double the area of protected areas on Earth. And in terms of Indigenous rights, of course, that's extremely significant because, according to some sources at least, the establishment of national parks and wildlife reserves and so on is the single biggest threat to Indigenous lands and their rights. And as survival, amongst others, have been documenting for many years now, can result in extreme hardship, evictions of Indigenous people from their lands, destruction of their livelihoods, their cultures, serious human rights abuses, including murder, rape, brutality, and so on. So this potential doubling nearly of global protected areas globally could be very serious, but it's established as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Fortunately, as a result of much lobbying by Indigenous peoples at the time preceding the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, some kind of qualifying language was put in this target. This 30% by 2030 target should be achieved whilst recognizing Indigenous and traditional territories and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, unfortunately, in the framework, in the monitoring plan for how this target is being implemented, as it stands, there are very good measures being adopted whereby the conservation community can tell whether 30% of the world is being progressively being put under protective status by simply counting the area of national parks and so on. But there is nothing in the monitoring plan as yet to ensure that this is being done whilst respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And unfortunately, the same can be said for the 2 or 3 other mentions of Indigenous rights or the respect of Indigenous knowledge throughout the monitoring plan for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this risks precisely what Survival and others have been fearing about this plan from the very outset, is that it could presage or stimulate a rush towards these increased conservation targets without properly respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Because if no one's monitoring it, then quite likely it's simply not going to happen. So that applies to pretty much all of the monitoring plan and is a serious lack as far as we're concerned, and needs very much to be addressed. And you'll see some of the potential consequences of this in a moment now when I move on to talk about funding, the second major issue that we're really concerned about and that I'll really concentrate on. And I mean, this has been, of course, a series of a lot of controversy and a lot of debate and disagreement, and was at the time that the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. And it's bearing in mind particularly that most of the world's biodiversity is found in poor countries. Who exactly is going to pay for this? Now, there are much wider issues at play here, and I won't try and go into all of those actually, about the scale and the equity of this kind of funding, not to say the sources of it. And that is a discussion that is very much ongoing at the moment and will certainly go on during the next COP in Colombia. One of the things that happened with some controversy, I have to say, at the time the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, and this was against many of the wishes of the poorer countries in the world, was that a global biodiversity framework fund was set up. I mean, it was set up not quite in the way that people had hoped it to be, or by the agencies that hoped it would be. And again, the question is, well, what benefit or cost might this have for Indigenous peoples? Just stepping back a little bit, so just to explain how this Global Biodiversity Framework Fund works, the GBFF. It's set up under the management of the Global Environment Facility, an agency which works as a kind of collaboration between the World Bank and other multilateral development banks and certain UN agencies in particular. And it was controversial from the outset. I mean, it aims, of course, to help countries achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework goals. It's only as yet received about $250 million in funding commitments, mostly from Canada, Germany, and the UK. It's a long way short, very, very long way short of what conservationists and poor countries believe is needed to help them achieve the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. As yet, about 110 million of that has been approved for spending in the shape of 4 full projects and 18 project concepts. Now, another interesting thing about the GBFF is that it's said in its objectives that it's expected to support the human rights-based implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And on paper, this looks like a good thing, but as Survival and others have been arguing, there has to be a rights basis for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework so that we don't see the kinds of problems that we've seen in the past with conservationist abuse in the sense of Indigenous rights. It was also last year an aspirational target set for the GBFF that 20% of all the disbursements would go to projects with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Well, we've looked at these claims, and we've looked at all the projects and concepts that have so far been approved for funding under the GBFF. One of the things that was already controversial about the way that this fund was set up was that there's only access to it for 18 approved organisations. And those are, again, the multilateral development banks, a couple of large conservation corporations, WWF and Conservation International, and certain UN agencies. So in many senses, it already excludes most poor countries and certainly all Indigenous peoples and local communities from applying to the fund itself. Another controversial point about it is that under the general Global Environment Facility rules for funding that apply to this particular Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, the organisation does not require that the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples has to be obtained for any projects which are approved on its lands. And in that sense, the Global Environment Facility and this new fund, which it's managing, is not consistent with international norms and laws regarding the pursuit of free, prior and informed consent for Indigenous peoples before things happen on their land and not after. So looking at these 22 projects that have so far been approved, what we found is that so far only one of them actually is directly related to protecting Indigenous lands. And this, in fact, was the very first project proposed to it by a Brazilian government agency. Of the 4 full projects that have been approved, all of them are actually or potentially on Indigenous lands, but none of them have obtained the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous people. And the funding has actually been predominantly for precisely what we imagined it would be for protected areas and related projects, like zoning lands to later become protected areas. There's been a lot of claims made in the application documents and the proposals for funding from this fund about how Indigenous peoples, local communities are going to be benefiting from it. But on closer scrutiny, we find that most of these are at best highly questionable and at worst just outright fictitious. There's only actually about 7% of the funding that we could identify that is definitely going to Indigenous peoples related projects. And by way of comparison for that, the funding that will go to these various big agencies that have access to the fund and are able to make proposals to it, just the pure agency fees, which they get just for submitting proposals to it, plus some management fees and kind of other project padding costs in there, come to nearly a quarter of the entire fund that's so far been approved. And for just 4 organisations, that's WWF, Conservation International, United Nations Development Programme and FAO, count for about 85–86% of the project and of all the funding that's so far been approved. So they have been the most successful at capturing the funds so far. Projects which actually address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, which in the kind of run-up to the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, many said is what we really, really need to be focusing on. We can't just keep dealing with the symptoms. We have to address the underlying causes like overconsumption, lack of regulation of companies, and so on and so forth. But destructive subsidies for industries that destroy biodiversity. These kinds of projects, unfortunately, so far in this new Global Biodiversity Fund, only account for about 6% of the funding. And I'll just end by giving one quick example of one of the programs that's been approved. It's called the Strengthening Management of the Sangha Trinational Project. It concerns 3 strictly protected areas, covering a vast area, 27,000 square kilometres, including their buffer zones, across the borders of Cameroon, Central African Republic, and the Republic of Congo. 2 of these national parks have long records of appropriation of Indigenous lands, eviction of them, and violent abuses against Indigenous peoples and local communities, such as documented in this report here. You can see on the right, and this one here from Survival International in recent years. This project, as I mentioned, has been, the concept at least, has been approved. The cost of this is going to be about $7 million. just the agency fees and the monitoring fees that are going to WWF for this are about 11% of the total budget cost. That most of the rest is going straight into an opaque London-based trust. It's a charity, registered charity actually, called the Trinational Sangha Fund, which actually already has about $70 million in the bank. I mean, it's hard by any measure to understand how a project like this can be deemed to be one of the more important and needy projects of the very limited funding there is for protection of biodiversity, especially in the context when it's associated with activities that have led to serious human rights abuses and a lot of controversy in the past. And also just to mention that this particular fund that this money is being channeled through has already come to the attention of the international media a few years ago when it was noted that its activities were potentially funding even further human rights abuses in the countries and areas concerned. So some conclusions about this. We draw on the first 2 years or so of the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. It's certainly failing to uphold or promote the very much needed rights-based implementation of the biodiversity framework. It's certainly not so far achieving anything like 20% of funding to Indigenous peoples and local communities. There seem to be serious problems with the due diligence and project screening for it. It's largely, in fact, being captured by wealthy northern conservation organizations and UN agencies. There's a lack of transparency in any safeguard measures that are being upheld for Indigenous peoples or not upheld, as the case may be. And it's serving, rather than to be a transformational type of fund with a new approach, just simply reinforcing the old top-down fortress conservation model that we've seen pit conservation against local communities and Indigenous peoples for decades in the past. And moreover, and sadly, it's not doing much or anything to tackle the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. So we think this is a fund that desperately needs major reconsideration going forward. So that's enough from me on those aspects of it. So the next serious concern that we have, biodiversity credits as a new concept, I'll hand you over to Frederick Ash for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Before passing to Frederick, I would just like to say that all this information that we have been sharing about the funding and so where the money is going, who are the organizations, as we show 86% is going mostly to same big 5 or 4 organizations that have been doing conservation projects unsuccessfully and violating human rights in the past. All these analyses are, we have done a report and it's available for journalists. So I saw that there was a question if there was any publication or reports summarizing this data. Yes, there is. We haven't shared it because it was a little bit more detailed than the brief, and we thought your time is limited. But if you want to see it, just write us an email. I will share the contact detail at the end of the conference, and we will share with you this report that we will also publish online. But for now, it's very new, so we have it just for us. But there is no problem. We can share that with you. So thank you very much, Simon, for this. So as we see, despite the nice wording in the Target 3, both the monitoring of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the funding is actually continuing what I would say, reproducing the top-down kind of militarized conservation that we have seen in the past that is failing both the people and the planet. I will now give a platform to Frederick, who is going to talk more about this very, very dangerous concept of biodiversity credit. Thank you so much, Frederick.
Thank you, Fior. I will share my screen. Right. So I'm guessing all of you are familiar with biodiversity offsetting to some extent. As a reminder, this is the same principle as carbon offsetting, right? It's the idea that instead of curbing or destruction, it would be possible to compensate for it by some actions somewhere and at a different time. So I will take a very basic example. Imagine you're a company and you want to build an airport terminal in the south of Spain over a flamingo habitat. Well, you have three cases. The first case is traditional environmental regulation, where you may be told, no, you need to do your airport terminal somewhere else. The second one is classic biodiversity offsetting, where you might be told, okay, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate by recreating a flamingo habitat within, say, 10 kilometers. Even though in reality, we know that in most cases, we are unable to comprehensively recreate all the ecosystemic functions destroyed. And the third case is an extreme version of biodiversity offsetting that is somewhere more aligned with what's coming, where you would be told, okay, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate somewhere in the world and not necessarily by the same type of habitat or species that was destroyed. So say, hypothetically, you could destroy flamingo habitat in Spain and compensate by recreating a habitat for bats in Bangladesh. And of course, this extreme version doesn't make any sense from an environmental integrity perspective, but this is the one that enables to create a financial market, because by making restoration generic, no longer tied to specific destruction, a specific place, you can restore before destroying, and then you can collect the credits, which you can then freely trade and speculate on their future value until they're being used. So that's generally the concept of biodiversity offsetting. So it's essentially the same as carbon offsetting, except it's infinitely worse, because in one case, you have 6 main greenhouse gases with relatively stable equivalences, and the other, you have millions of species linked by a complex web of interdependencies. And by the way, biodiversity offsetting is only one of several forthcoming nature markets. Another one that is coming and is already happening in the UK, but it's happening also in other countries, is called nutrient mitigation trading, which is a market trading permits to pollute rivers. Now, the thing is, biodiversity offsetting is not new. I mean, we may not have heard of it until recently, but in fact, biodiversity offsetting has been existing for decades in the US, Canada, and Australia. And so it's interesting because we have quite a lot of data today. And the track record of the existing initiatives is that the restoration projects fail in most cases, between 2/3, 3/4, depending on the type of habitat, etc. And the reason for that is simple. It's because it's incredibly complicated, costly, and takes a long time to recreate habitats. I mean, the science of restoration is only in its infancy. And also our knowledge of ecosystems is only very partial. We have yet a lot to discover. I believe that 20% of species only have been taxonomized so far. So that explains why it's the track record of biodiversity offsetting so far is so poor. Now, the issue, so there are many issues with biodiversity offsetting, and the first one is the one that I already mentioned, and the incompleteness of our scientific knowledge and the difficulty to recreate. But the fact also that by definition, even if it succeeded 100% of the time, offsetting merely displaces destruction, doesn't curb it. The issue also that I mentioned earlier is that in order to have a market, a functioning and liquid market, you need to oversimplify to the extreme and transform millions of species and wide variety of habitat types into a few liquid tradable assets. And that is simply not feasible with a reasonable level of environmental integrity. And one additional issue is the transfer of sovereignty. Essentially, by creating these markets, we are transferring critical conservation choices from governments to financial markets, because we let financial markets decide what will be the price of the different types of credits, and therefore which restoration projects will be undertaken or not. And unfortunately, it's very unlikely that financial markets priorities will match ecological priorities. So it questions the fact that we should transfer these conservation decisions that are critical to our survival to financial markets that are well known for their mood swings. Now, we hear a lot, and we've heard a lot recently that, yeah, but this will be different. We will have high integrity credits. This will be much better. Well, the history of carbon offset, where we heard the same promises, makes us a bit doubtful, but also we have the UN, the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, who has already stated that in theory, in order to issue credits, we should be able to monitor and identify some positive impact on biodiversity. But in some cases, it may not be practical to wait until we issue the credit, so we might issue before any impact is witnessed. So much for the forthcoming high integrity. So on the environmental front, sadly, it's fairly clear that this will be a failure. I mean, there's been plenty of academic research on the topic over the past decade as well. And on the social front, the issues are likely to be very similar to that of carbon offsetting. I mean, we know that offsetting will require a lot of land. And so that would add to the issues of land grabbing and conflicts over land use and human rights violations that we have already seen with many carbon offset projects. As for another angle that we hear quite often is that, oh, this will bring additional revenues for small farmers. Again, there are reasons to be very cautious with such promises. I mean, if we see, for example, what's happening in some places, we see that as farmers may get revenues from the sale of these credits, in parallel, traditional farming subsidies are likely to be reduced, leading as a net effect to more volatile revenues, but not more money. Now, the main argument, one of the main arguments that we hear to promote this market is about the funding gap, right? It's about closing the funding gap for funding nature, etc. And this argument is not new. This is the same framing that we hear for many other of these schemes. Now, but if we look at the target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it says, and that's the UN, that we should increase funding for nature by around $200 million annually. And well, if we compare that to the current amount of harmful subsidies, I mean, the harmful subsidies, implicit harmful subsidies, according to the World Bank, represent $6 trillion per year. And so what that says is that there's absolutely no need to create a market to fund the funding gap. I mean, we only need to redirect a fraction of the current harmful subsidies. So that's one crucial element. Now the question is why are these markets about to happen, and what's the reason if we know that they will likely fail, have no environmental integrity, and create the same social issues? Well, the instrument may be new, but the politics are absolutely not. And the good news is it's exactly the same. Well, the good news for understanding purposes, but the bad news is it's the same politics of carbon offsetting. The main political goal of biodiversity market is arguably to buy some time, to delay real action from the global north country in order to protect corporate profits for a few more years by diverting the conversation away from the need to curb destruction at home. So this is really about protecting the status quo primarily. And secondly, but that's really a secondary goal, for some countries such as the UK and France, there is the clear stated intent to benefit from this new, very profitable asset class for their own financial sector that tries to rebrand itself as green finance hub. And again, the politics of it are absolutely not new. I mean, it's Bush Sr. who famously said at the Rio summit that the American way of life is non-negotiable. Well, it's pretty much all in this sentence, right? It's we will not change no matter what. And so that's pretty much explains it all. The money at stake is absolutely tremendous. Also, it is not to be underestimated. There was a World Economic Forum report a few years ago who said that prioritizing nature would be a $10 trillion business opportunity, etc., etc. So sadly, we're at a crossroad. We're pretty much where we were with climate politics before the Paris Agreement, except this time with biodiversity, and we're about to embark on a false solution that will waste at least a decade. What is new and noteworthy amongst the recent developments on that field is that what is coming up is likely a regulatory market, not voluntary. And that's one of the few lessons that have been learned from carbon offsetting, is that voluntary doesn't scale. So there's a lot of push from neoliberal governments and private lobbies to have biodiversity offsetting be regulatory, which means there will be a mandatory obligation to offset, as is the case, for example, in the UK, where you need to offset in order to obtain your building permit. And that changes everything, because that means that the market is likely to be infinitely bigger than offsetting as it stands currently, and a complete change of scale, which would magnify in turn all the issues that I mentioned earlier. Another key development is there's been a lot of linguistic acrobatics in continental Europe, at least, to explain that biodiversity credits will not be used for offsetting purposes. And the reason for that is that a lot of people have realized that offsetting doesn't work. I mean, we've seen it with carbon, we've seen the Vera scandal, etc., etc. But these linguistic acrobatics it's always the same misrepresentations. I mean, we heard for a few months that credits would not be used for offsetting, and then you had Sylvie Goulard, which is the French co-chair of the IAPB task force, who stated that credits could be used as offsets. And now we hear from the European Commission, for example, and in some countries that, oh no, we want to promote certificates, and they're very different from credits, and none of them will not be used for offsetting. But again, when you dig a little bit further, they acknowledge that actually certificates could be used for offsetting purposes in some cases, etc., etc. And in fact, the reality of it is that, for example, in continental Europe, our biodiversity strategy is based on a net gain principle. And net means, by definition, offsetting, because you measure in one single metric destruction and restoration. So the issue, again, is really important to understand this. I mean, just like with carbon, right? With carbon, the aviation lobby expects to double carbon emissions while offsetting them. There is no cap in offsetting. It's actually a way to enable a further increase in destruction and emissions. And sadly, this would also, basing our conservation policies on offsetting and biodiversity credit markets would enable destruction to continue and possibly increase and not curb it. Now, a third important development is that there's been a lot of emphasis recently on getting IPLC endorsement on some of these schemes, etc. As Simon stated earlier, there are reasons to doubt that in reality there will be a real free, prior, and informed consent. And also, there is a very worrying statement that have been made recently, amongst others, by the CDC Biodiversity, on the fact that the sale of these biodiversity credits may be pitched as replacing loss and damages payments for global South countries. So where are we now? Well, the UK has launched its own biodiversity offset market earlier this year. In the EU, you probably all have seen Ursula von der Leyen speech recently, where she said that she wants to create a market to restore our planet. One interesting thing is that she compared it to the EU ETS, the EU carbon market, saying that we already have a successful carbon market, so now we need to expand it to biodiversity. But of course, there is a major difference between the two, because the EU cap and trade has a cap on annual emissions, whereas a biodiversity offset market would not have a cap on annual biodiversity destruction. So it would be worth, I believe, asking her directly the question, but I guess we already know the answer. And the third and main thing coming up at COP16 is that you have the three main initiatives that have been promoting the creation of a global biodiversity market. So you have the IAPB, right, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, which is the French-UK initiative that joined forces with the UN Biodiversity Credit Alliance and joined forces as well with the World Economic Forum and McKinsey, which is a third key initiative to present together jointly their funding and their blueprint for a market, and also launched 30 pilot projects worldwide. So this is absolutely a crucial moment for biodiversity. This is the crossroad where we may embark on a false solution. And sadly, as much as quite a few people have heard nowadays about carbon offsetting, there is a complete lack of awareness from the general public about what's about to happen in their name. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Frederic. Yes, we also don't have to forget that the biodiversity credits are pushed by the conservation industry, which we mean the big conservation organizations, to gain more funding for protected areas that will end up as every other protected area that we have been analyzing in the past, evicting indigenous people. So to create these credits as carbon credits, to generate them, they need land, and that land is usually taken from indigenous peoples in the global south. So it's a big threat for them too. I have some questions that have been written in the chat, and for the ones who prefer to speak directly, they can raise their hands. I will just go for one question for Simon and one question for Simon for Frederic, reading in the chat, and then others who want to talk, they can write here in the chat or raise their hand. So there's one question, I will read both of them. So one for Frederic, which I find very interesting. It came from Marine Digabel from AFE, and she asked, what is the difference that the EU make between the certificates and the credits? I think it's a very interesting question, because you might have seen many members of the European Commission are saying we're not going to use biodiversity credit to offset, they're just certificates. And I saw also that African Parks, the big conservation NGO, is already selling these certificates from protected areas. So can you then explain us more about this difference, if any, exist? And the question for Simon is about how the projects in the fund that goes under the global biodiversity funding are selected. So you say there were 18 that were selected, how these projects are selected, and linked to the other question that Estela Paul from IPS News made, why the funding end up to big few organizations, and why they're not end up to indigenous organizations. So if you can tell us more about the selection process, that would be very helpful. Frederic, do you want to go first?
Sure. So basically, the question refers to what happened last week when you had a few MEPs who challenged the European Commission on their support for biodiversity credits. And indeed, the EU Commissioner made a reference to a certificate that would allegedly be different from credit. But there is no difference as I understand it, because I mean, I'm part of the EU expert group, the Climate Biodiversity Nexus, where the EU position on this market is debated. And frankly, I've never heard any talk about certificates. So I believe, I'm not sure what he was referring to, or if it's a real thing. I believe it was more of a way to avoid answering the questions and get a. But again, for me, it falls into the linguistic acrobatics to try and avoid accountability.
Thank you, Frederic. Simon, do you want to reply to the question?
Yeah, sure. I think the question is actually about how will the 18 agencies which are approved to apply for the Global Biodiversity Framework Funds, how were they selected? rather than the projects, which are now being selected.
Yes.
And yeah, and well, I mean, you have to dig deeply into the structure and the purpose of the GEF to work that one out. I mean, they are approved according to certain criteria, the scale of operations, the breadth of their portfolios, the ability to comply with the GEF's requirements, and so on and so forth. But if you look at those criteria, you'll see that they're extremely exclusive, actually. And it is only the very large multilateral banks like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the very, very biggest of the conservation corporations that are ever going to be able to comply with this. So it's pretty much self-selecting few, actually. And and as I mentioned earlier, it really does effectively put this new fund beyond the reach of the people that I think many of us agree, the indigenous peoples and local communities that have the most to do, actually, and can achieve the most at lower costs, actually. So that's that's one of the extreme limitations. And as I said, I think one of the reasons why the selection of this design of this fund under the Global Environment Facility was always controversial and will always be exclusive, actually.
Yes, sorry, Simon. I linked to the other question that she made about why this funding is going to these big few organizations, not to indigenous organizations, not only the 18 projects that were selected. I think it would be important for people.
They are the only people that can apply for it.
Yes, that's very interesting to learn. Yes, just to Simon replied, you can say in the answer that it's the Global Biodiversity Fund is only limited to 18 agencies that are approved by the Global Environmental Funding Fund. So it's interesting already to know that. Okay, there's another question for Frederick from Phoebe Whetstone from The Guardian. She would like to know, what do you think will be the most significant biodiversity credit announcement to happen at the COP16?
I think the IAPB events will be really worth monitoring. The big announcement, I guess, will be the detail that will be unveiled on the feature of this market to come. There's many features and each of them is crucial. Whether, for example, the type of biodiversity credits, what will be the use cases, whether it will be for offsetting like for like or like for better, it's very different, right? Whether there will be allowance to trade internationally credits or not, etc. So the blueprint of this market and the related 30 pilot project worldwide will be absolutely crucial, because we will see we will get a sense of whether this global market is being a copy-paste of the UK, how is it different, and that will give us the opportunity to make a first assessment of the environmental issues and social issues.
Thank you, Frederick. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. I invite people to please put their names, but I will read it anyway. It's more for Simon. Simon, can you give us examples of the sort of impact that carbon credits are having on indigenous people's rights? And how do you see the trades of biodiversity credits, happening on the ground?
Yeah, sure. There are multiple impacts and threats from both carbon credits and biodiversity credits, in very similar ways, actually. In order to operate most carbon offsetting projects in areas like tropical forests, for example, or in some cases rangelands, savanna lands, grasslands, what's essentially required is you have to stop or at least minimize most human impact. It's actually quite easy to target local communities and indigenous peoples who, for example, use slash and burn farming as their traditional form of farming, as being a destructive livelihood activity. So you essentially put a fence around it, you call it a carbon project or maybe a protected area, and you remove those people from the land. That's what's been happening in some projects. And of course, that is the end of their livelihoods, can be the end of their cultures and them as a community. So that's been seen in a number of examples. The same can happen in rangelands with preventing pastoralists, for example, from grazing because they're deemed to be overgrazing, thereby reducing the vegetation and the soil carbon. We've seen that with a notorious case in Kenya, for example. And as was mentioned earlier, that what's actually been happening, and it came along actually also very much with the Global Biodiversity Framework, is that the use of market mechanisms, both carbon and biodiversity credits, is seen very much as funding this expansion of protected areas to 30% of the planet. In fact, it's very difficult for them, the conservation industry, let's say, to see how else it can be funded. So if these projects are tied to carbon funding, then what you're doing essentially is tying the market mechanisms to strict protection, which is, as we've seen historically, often an exclusionary model. You have to get people out of that. You have to kind of separate people from nature to let the carbon, the trees regenerate, even if there were not trees there before. For the biodiversity, such as you're going to then try and count and sell as credits, for that to carry on, existing. So that's the real threat. It can be to livelihoods, territorial rights, cultures, and so on. A very, very broad range of potential impacts. And as mentioned, we're starting to see these happen already with the likes of the expansion of protected areas by African Parks. Again, an organization whose human rights record is being seriously questioned recently, using both carbon and biodiversity credits.
Thank you, Simon. There is another question. I don't know if you, who of the two of you want to reply to this. It's always from Marine. What about scientifically robust, practice-based methodologies to organize restorations in Western countries? So not helping the global South, but significant to make agro-industry change practices. Is it also a false solution compared to regulation?
Well, I want to clarify that it's not that restoration is a bad thing, right? Restoration is a good thing insofar as it comes in addition to curbing destruction domestically and not instead of, right? So the issue is not restoration, the issue is offsetting. If we have regulation that mandates a progressive decline in destruction at home, and we try to restore degraded land in parallel, that is a good thing. The issue is when you use it for offsetting purposes to obfuscate the fact that destruction does not decline and in fact may increase. I also want to highlight that there is the case has never been made for why we would need a market to do it. I mean, even for, there's no reason to, a market mechanism is not even necessary for offsetting. Offsetting already existed before a market, and the case has yet to be made for a market. But again, coming back to the point, restoration, as I said earlier, is very complicated, it's very lengthy, it's very costly, fails quite frequently. We need it, but in addition to curbing destruction, so in addition to regulation, and absolutely not as offsetting.
Thank you, Frederic. Just in case we won't be able to probably to reply to all the questions, so the ones who are we couldn't reply now in live, you can email then your questions to the contacts I will be giving later. Just a question for you, Frederic, from Nevin, chief editor of Interesting. Do you believe there will be plans to establish a multinational regulatory body to oversee this biodiversity market to mitigate any failures, especially in regards to upholding the right of the various indigenous peoples and local communities?
Yes, I would expect there would be some kind of international governance body around it, for sure. Who will be composed of and how, we will see in a few weeks. But yes, that would make sense. And also, if you look at what the current big lobby initiatives are pushing for, they already have this working group on governance, etc. So they will try to not only make it happen, but I guess one interesting angle would be to monitor what's the composition of this governing body, whether it's balanced or not, whose interest it represents, etc., etc.
Sorry, but this is my question. But do you think that a regulatory body that will oversee this biodiversity market will actually avoid human rights abuses and land theft happen?
Well, I mean, I do not know, but history suggests that there's a lot of boilerplate statements, and also a lot of these groups and bodies have a very imbalanced membership. So I would be very cautious and monitor it very closely.
Thank you. We have a question from Stella Paul of IPS News. If I mispronounce names or media, I'm sorry about that. It's a question for you, Frederic. We have previously seen that the extremely complicated process of carbon credit certification got many community-led initiatives away from the process and didn't let them qualify for carbon certificates. How do you see Indigenous peoples' organizations will ever be able to get certified? She's just trying to understand the difficulties that they can face. I think that Simon also could comment on this in the answer. I leave Frederic also to reply.
That is more for Simon, I believe. I want to highlight the recent civil society statement signed by more than 200 civil society organizations, as well as the statement from Via Campesina, who show that you have a lot of concerns also from these stakeholders. Now, the difficulty for them to get certified, I guess Simon has much more expertise than I have.
I mean, so we've seen a lot of claims in the past that carbon markets, carbon offsetting projects can, in theory, help Indigenous communities such as those living in the Amazon. In practice, what's been found, though, pretty much consistently over at least 2 decades, is that I mean, 2 things: the practicalities of Indigenous communities of being able to get involved in or run or equitably benefit from carbon offsetting projects are almost insurmountable. Well, science is not always science, actually, but the techniques involved in developing a carbon offset project are immensely complicated. The documentation is incredibly difficult. There's some very, very difficult maths involved in it, apart from anything else. And you get the impression sometimes that even the project developers don't really fully understand it because it is so complex. It's almost all done by international consultants, almost all in English. So already you've got some very major obstacles there to understanding of these kinds of projects by Indigenous communities who may or may have very little kind of shared tertiary education amongst them, for example, not in all cases, but some. So these are pretty big obstacles, and also a kind of more fundamental issue that's becoming more clear actually, as some of these carbon market ideas have been tested with Indigenous communities, is that they often find that it just runs up directly against their cosmology, their worldviews, and their values, who see themselves as very much kind of embedded in nature, and that nature simply cannot be commodified in this way, because this is essentially what both carbon crediting and biodiversity crediting is doing, is placing a monetary value on what they see as part and parcel of their entire existences. So and that now increasingly, as I say, tends to be where Indigenous communities are being promised, quite substantial inducements to get involved in both biodiversity and carbon crediting. They're just saying, no, look, we don't really understand this, and we don't. This runs against their worldview. So those, I think, are the challenges. And the thing is with biodiversity credits is that if carbon offsetting has been complex, and it really truly is very complex, biodiversity offsetting can only be much worse. We're not dealing with one single commodity, i.e., one single element of an ecosystem. The amount of carbon, tons of carbon. We're dealing with this huge diversity, as Frederic was mentioning earlier, of different species, subspecies, ecotypes, ecosystems. I mean, how you measure and place a value on that is in itself, an almost insurmountable challenge. How you monitor changes in that over a period of time, incredibly difficult. So for Indigenous communities themselves to get, kind of meaningfully involved in this, I think is going to be a pretty big challenge. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. I have a question actually from my colleagues to Frederic and Simon both, is that what kind of questions could journalists ask during the COP what are the key questions the journalists should be asking to governments that are promoting biodiversity credits, all this kind of funding during the COP16? If you have.
Well, there are many questions that could be asked. I wish Mrs. van der Leyen would be asked whether she intends to put an annual carbon biodiversity extraction as per her comparison with the EU carbon market. I guess I would like to ask them how they justify the need to create a market, given that merely redirecting a fraction of harmful subsidies would be sufficient to close the funding gap.
Simon?
Yeah, I think I'd probably ask some of the questions that were asked and never really answered at the time that the carbon markets were starting to become established. And that's, I mean, what is the actual need for this? Why is there a need for this? What are the alternative ways of doing this? What are the actual transaction costs of doing this? Can the free market in such a commodity ever provide what's known to be necessary, both for nature itself in a sense and for communities, is regular, reliable funding? In fact, markets can never provide that because markets always fluctuate. So what happens in the lean years of these projects? Do we just stop caring for biodiversity, or what, for example? How big is the actual funding gap? As some conservationists claim, we need $700 billion a year for conservation. Really? I mean, I think probably not. Where is the evidence that this is ever likely to work? So I think there's some pretty fundamental questions about this that need asking of the political leaders who seem to be pushing us in the direction of biodiversity funding through these market mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think it's time to finish. We didn't have the time to go through all the questions, but as I said, I will share with you. I hope you can see it now. These are the contacts of my colleagues in the press department. They're in different languages. I invite you to write the questions to one of them, whatever language you prefer. And we will be able, hopefully, to reply to the questions. And if you want to also arrange an interview with Simon or with Frederic, of course, that will also be possible. These emails should, they're also written in the emails you got from Survival. So I hope you have the time now to copy them. I also invite one of my colleagues, if possible, to share it in the chat because I can't write. Okay, I will now, yeah. So, and that's just one other thing. This entire conference is live streamed in YouTube, so it will be available in YouTube when we finish the press conference. So you will be able to follow it from there. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, Frederic, for this, and all the people, the many journalists who are attending. Thank you very much for the information you gave us. And as I said, the analysis that Simon wrote about the funding is available also for journalists if you want to. I keep repeating it. We haven't put a link in our brief, but it's there. And they're both available to reply to your questions if you send us an email to the emails I shared before. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.